Today we're going to be talking about habitat loss. And habitat loss is really any way in which a habitat where an organism or group of organisms is living is going to be changed, altered. It can be changed from one type into another. It can be completely destroyed into where it's no longer a habitat, which is really one of the growing concerns when we look at habitat loss. So habitat fragmentation is also considered a form of habitat loss. What we're gonna see in habitat fragmentation is ecosystems and habitats are going to be divided into smaller portions. Now, originally this was designed, or this idea of habitat fragmentation came about because we said, well, what if we put, an industrial center here, and then we left a strip of forest here, and then we put some, commercial space here, and then left this little strip of forest here. And so we thought, well, we're not completely destroying the habitat. We're still leaving a small segment of that habitat, and that's enough for those organisms to live in. And then also, the people who are living in these areas get the benefit of having some nature around them. So it was a well thought out idea, or at least it had good intentions when it was developed. But as we'll see, the habitat fragmentation has some pretty big drawbacks to it as well. So when we look at habitat loss, why does it matter? Right? What's the big problem with habitat losses? If we move, organisms from one environment to another, they can just move, can't they? Well, the problem becomes is when you have a habitat loss in any situation, whether it's rearranged or whether it's completely removed, you're going to greatly disrupt the organisms that live there. Right? The amount of habitat, the amount of space that they have to live in has been greatly reduced. And so that's going to greatly reduce the amount of individuals that you find living in that area. Species diversity is going to decline. You're going to see, perhaps the extinction of certain species depending on where these changes are being made. And right now, as it sits, the habitat loss is thought to be one of the most important threats to biodiversity that's presently occurring. And remember, biodiversity is just that diversity of life, right? When we have these protected habitats, when we have these habitats that are all together, all of the organisms are interacting in the ways that they're supposed to be, all of those relationships and interdependence, they're all working. When the habitats are rearranged or when they're fragmented up, then we see disruptions in food webs and food chains and all different types of things, nutrient availability, and that just really disrupts those organisms that are living there. So what are some of the causes behind habitat loss? How do we wind up with these areas that are being changed? There's a lot of things that can happen to a habitat which would fall under the title of habitat loss. Mostly, we're talking about things that are caused by humans. When we look at organisms, they don't really destroy each other's habitats, right? You don't go into a forest and it just wrecked because the birds have destroyed all the trees or anything like that. So most of these problems that we're going to be discussing are something as the result of either expansion by humans or industrialization or something along those lines. So the first example we would see in habitat loss would be just building, right? If we're just building, whether it's building an office park or whether it's building a subdivision or whether it's building anything. If we go into an area and say, oh, wow, this is a really nice flat area, this would make a great area for a bunch of homes. And so we go in there and we clear out the few trees that maybe are there, and we just start building homes. So when we do that, all the organisms that lived in that grassland or in that forest, they no longer live there. They can now, once the houses are built and things kind of settle down, there's going to be some animals that move back into that area. You're going to have some squirrels. You're going to have some rabbits. But a lot of your animals that live in the denser part of that forest are going to be gone. Deer, fox, those types of animals. And so they're not going to be really, their habitat's just kind of been replaced with something else. They don't live in houses, they live in trees, and they hide in tall grasses and those types of things. So building is really probably one of the biggest issues with habitat loss. And it's one of those problems that we're going to continue to face because as the human population continues to grow and as we continue to expand, we need more and more space to live in. And so that requires us to kind of repurpose a lot of natural spaces into spaces that are suitable for humans. One of the other things that we look at with habitat loss is when we drain a wetland. So a wetland is an area where there's just like low amounts of water. It's usually just kind of stagnant water. It acts as a really like a water purification system. Water comes into that area and it stays there, and just through natural processes, the water gets cleaned, and it can re-enter the groundwater supply or re-enter the water supply. But for a while now, it's been a practice to go in, drain out a wetland, and then fill that in with topsoil and make it a usable space. Because we look at it and say, oh, that's a wetland. We can't really do anything with that. And they said, yeah, but if it wasn't a wetland, this is a prime area to build whatever the case may be. So once we drain that wetland, it's no longer a wetland. It's no longer carrying out those ecological services that it did while it was a wetland. And so all the organisms that were living there, that are a lot of them that are aquatic, they have now been misplaced. Another place where we see habitat loss is through grazing, which is done by livestock. So, if as the human population continues to expand, we have a lot of more food that has to be produced. We have to have more land set aside for agriculture. We also have to have more land set aside for grazing animals, for our livestock, for pigs and chickens and cows and all those other things. They all can't be confined to small little spaces. So we set aside areas that may be natural, and then we turn them into farms or ranches for cattle or whatever the case may be. And so again, that's a form of habitat loss where it was once something and now it's become something else. I already mentioned the agriculture. Again, more people on the planet, more food needs to be produced, and so we're going to have to grow that food. We can't grow all the food in greenhouses, right? We have to have large, sprawling, spaces of land where we can grow corn and wheat and rice and all of the other things consumed by people of the world. One practice that also it would seem as impactful, but it's called dredging. And dredging is basically where we remove sediments from the bottoms of bodies of water. So whether it be lakes or rivers or whatever the case may be, but the sediment builds up there, and so we'll go through and we'll dredge that. And when we do that, that's really disruptive to the ecosystem, because what's on the bottom of that body of water has pretty much, settled, and it's been, hasn't been altered in a while. And we go through, we drag that to pick up those sediments. And again, we're displacing a lot of organisms. And then the last one where we really consider habitat loss would be any type of clearing. So this would be for a number of purposes. We could clear an area for lumber. We could clear an area to mine it. But again, anytime we clear an area, we're completely destroying that habitat. Whatever it was before is no longer that, whether it becomes a mine or whether it becomes, a place where we just get lumber for all the things that we need. So that covers pretty much habitat loss. Now I want to kind of focus in on habitat fragmentation. And as I mentioned at the start, fragmentation results in pieces of the habitat being divided up. So what happens when we divide up an area? Let's say that this all is a forest, okay, and this is all trees, okay? And so a developer says, okay, it would be really nice to leave some of this forest, okay, and we're actually going to leave quite a bit of forest. So let's clear an entry point here, and then we'll build, in the middle here, and we'll leave forest all around it, right? And we'll just have trees all around this. Well, what happens when we do this is we create edges, okay? We create edges to the forest, and this is basically kind of like an edge factor that happens when you have habitat fragmentation. Along the edge of this forest, okay, so where the forest meets the construction, that creates an edge. The edge of a forest is different than the interior of the forest in climate, in soil environment, and because of that, it's also going to be different in species composition. What you see on the edge of a forest is different than what you see in the interior of a forest, right? You will see some animals come out of the forest, and you'll see different species, migrating out. But if you were to go deep into the forest, you're going to find species living there that you don't find everywhere else. So that edge effect that's created through fragmentation is significant. It's significant to where you're going to see a completely different composition of organisms living there. And all of those things work to kind of either, in some cases, drive organisms completely away. Habitat fragmentation is really what's responsible for removing wolves from the Midwest. Wolves need a very large area to roam. They hunt in packs. and they need a very large territory to pursue their prey and do the things that they do. So we thought that fragmentation would work for them. Even we were leaving out large stretches of land for them, but then we found, that they needed even larger stretches of land. So that's why we only see wolves, out to the west in Montana and Idaho, and some further up north in the northern parts of the United States, like in Minnesota. But outside of that, there's really no large expanses of land big enough for wolves. And again, we thought that habitat fragmentation would work for them, but for them and a lot of other organisms, it simply doesn't, because the area that they need is far too big to exist in a somewhat, populated area. So also another thing you're going to see in these edge effects and in these fragmentation is trees and other plants that can tolerate a lot of shade. They're going to stay in the interior part of the forest, right, where there's lots and lots of shade. And then you're going to see a whole new group of species that can't tolerate the shade, that couldn't survive in the forest, and now they're showing up at the edge because there's more light available, right, because there's fewer trees there. And so, again, anytime you change the vegetation, you're going to see a change in those organisms that rely on that vegetation as a response. So whether it's habitat loss or habitat fragmentation, both of those are going to cause a really big impact in the ecosystem and the organisms that live there.